Urinary system function and anatomy. We're going to begin by looking at the different functions of the urinary system. One is that it regulates water balance. Determining how much urine is lost and or conserved, we would regulate our water balance, or at least the water content of that urine. We regulate nitrogenous wastes. We can get rid of the nitrogenous waste that we've produced in our body. These are going to be formed from protein metabolism. Ammonia is relatively toxic in the body, and it gets converted to something less toxic called urea. We also regulate our blood solute concentration. We can manipulate how much sodium chloride, let's say, stays in the blood or gets lost in the urine. Other things that we can regulate would be potassium ions, calcium ions, hydrogen ions to help deal with the pH of the body, or creatinine. Let's go ahead and take a look at the organs of the urinary system. The kidneys are the major organ of the urinary system. The gross anatomy, looking at the kidney with the unaided eye, gives us a blood vessel, a renal artery, going to the kidney, giving it blood supply. So that's going to bring blood into the kidneys. There's also a renal vein, which, as you can imagine, is going to drain the blood from the kidney. And now if we're looking at the inside of the kidney, there's going to be two different types of tissue. The renal medulla is the first of those. It's a tissue on the middle or the inside of the kidneys. The structures that you find inside of the renal medulla are called renal pyramids simply because they look like triangles in shape. The renal cortex is the other type of tissue. This is on the outside of the kidneys. The structure that you'll see from the cortical tissue is the renal column. The renal column will dip down in between adjacent renal pyramids. And then the renal pelvis is a central region or a funnel-shaped region where the urine collects and empties into a structure called the ureter. Taking a look here at the picture, on the left you can see the artery and the vein going into the kidney, so that would be the renal artery and vein. You can also see the location, or the relative location, of the kidneys. If you look in the center at B, that is the kidney with a section taken, so we can see the inside of it. Again, you can see around the outside a light yellow tissue. That's cortical tissue or cortex, and you can see it every so often dips down to the center of the kidney. Additionally, you can see triangle-shaped structures. Those are renal pyramids. They're made up of medullary tissue. And then in the center, where all the urine is going to collect, we call that the renal pelvis, and it empties into a structure called the ureter, which will eventually take urine down to the urinary bladder. Now, the microscopic anatomy of the kidney involves a structure called the nephron. This is the functional unit of the kidney, or in other words, this is where all of the filtration is taking place. The first part is something called Bowman's capsule. This surrounds a ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. What Bowman's capsule is going to do is it's going to catch all the filtrate, or the material that has moved through the blood vessels and gets filtered out of the blood. The glomerulus, as I mentioned before, is a ball of capillaries. They're particularly leaky, and they allow a lot of materials to move through. Lots and lots of materials, actually, that we would want to conserve or reabsorb into the body. Now, as you travel from Bowman's capsule into the tubule system of the nephron, we get into something called the proximal tubule. This is a continuation of Bowman's capsule, and it's where most materials are going to be reabsorbed into the body. The proximal tubule is located within the cortical tissue, or in the cortex. So, taking a look at this picture, what we've got at the top is a ball of capillaries you can see in red, and around that is a C-shaped structure. That C-shaped structure is Bowman's capsule. So if you follow Bowman's capsule back, it starts to coil, the tubule does. That's your proximal tubule. Now as you look at this thing, you can see that it's going to continue on and make a big loop. That loop is called the loop of Henle. It's a continuation of the proximal tubule. It's going to dip down into the medulla and rise back up. So there's an ascending and a descending limb, and of course it's named according to the direction in which the filtrate is traveling. As I mentioned, it's located in the medulla or the medullary tissue. The distal tubule then is when the ascending limb of the loop of Henle starts to coil again. So it's a continuation of the loop of Henle. This is also located in the cortex just like the proximal tubule was. The distal tubule will empty into a structure called the collecting duct. The collecting duct then, as the name implies, is simply going to be collecting urine from multiple nephron. So it's going to receive urine from more than one nephron along the way. Ultimately, the collecting ducts empty into the renal pelvis, where we have that central region in the kidney collecting all of the urine. So taking a look at this picture, if we then pick up on the loop of Henle, you can see that it travels down into the pyramid, or into the medulla, comes back up, coils again, and then empties into the collecting duct. In the picture, the collecting duct is in brown, and you can see that they've drawn at least 4 other nephron emptying into that one collecting duct. We're now going to look at the blood supply to the nephron. If in fact the nephron is doing the filtering, we've got to get blood to the nephron to be filtered. The first of these is called the afferent arteriole. It brings blood directly into the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole then is going to be taking blood away from the glomerulus. So afferent arteriole brings blood in, it gets filtered into Bowman's capsule, and the remaining blood leaves through that efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole then supplies a bunch of capillaries called peritubular capillaries. The name peritubular means around the tubules, so this is going to supply both the proximal and the distal tubules. Again, the peritubular capillaries surround the proximal and distal tubules. There's also a blood vessel called the vasa recta. Vasa refers to blood vessel, recta means straight. These are capillaries that dip down and run along the length of the loop of Henle. Another structure that we're going to look at is something called the ureter. The ureter is a tube that transports urine from the renal pelvis down to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder then, of course, is a muscular organ that's going to be used to store urine. And the urethra is a tube that connects the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. The urethra, much like the rectum, the anus has 2 sphincters. It has an internal urethral sphincter, which is made up of smooth muscle, and it has an external urethral sphincter, which is made up of skeletal muscle. So the smooth muscle is an involuntary muscle. You have no control over that, where the skeletal muscle or the external urethral sphincter you do have control over. So again, when you were being potty trained, it was the external urethral sphincter that you were having to learn to control. All right, taking a look at this picture, we've got on the left side of the collecting duct here a blood vessel, and you can follow the arrow going into the glomerulus. That would be your afferent arteriole. The blood vessel leaving the glomerulus is the efferent arteriole. It will then branch and travel along the tubules, and we'd call that the peritubular capillaries. If you look off to the right side, you can see the vasa recta as well. It's the long capillaries that run along the length of the loop of Henle.